Welcome to Ask Us Marketing. I'm your host, Kalli Fedusenko of Kalli Collective, a digital marketing agency designed to build relationships between financial advisors and their target audience through data-driven content, websites, and advertising. Our episode today is brought to you by the Financial Planning Association, otherwise known as the FPA. The FPA is a great resource center providing education, support, and networking opportunities for financial advisors like you. Now, before we jump into our episode today, I'd like to invite you to take 2 minutes to complete our marketing scorecard and find out if your marketing is hitting the mark. Our scorecard will give you a crystal clear snapshot of what's working in your marketing strategy and where a little extra shine could make all the difference. Now, whether it's a PR hiccup or a full-blown crisis, knowing how to respond effectively can protect your reputation and business. John Rich from A Rich Opinion, a content and PR firm that helps leaders generate leads through brand growth, will be sharing his expert tips on preparing for the unexpected, crafting the right message, and navigating tough situations with confidence, which I'm very excited to pick his brain on this. So welcome with me, John Rich. Hi, John. How are you?
Hey, Kalli. It's great to be here. How you doing?
I'm doing pretty good. It's a Monday. Feels like a Wednesday.
Well,
I don't know if that's good or bad, but it is.
it could be good. Could be
Yeah.
good.
Okay, PR. Let's talk about, public relations. When shit hits the fan, what should you do? Starting with, why is it vital for businesses, especially financial advisors, to have a PR plan in place before a crisis happens?
Yeah, so certainly with anyone in the financial field, especially financial planners, certainly they're privy to a lot of sensitive information, whether that's, personal numbers, social security numbers, financial data, things of that nature. And so it's you're especially exposed to, kind of the consequences of a crisis. And so when thinking about planning, you really can't plan for something that you don't know what will happen or when it will happen or the gravity of which will happen, right?
Right.
However, I think a lot of good companies that think through this have a plan in terms of how do I address a crisis? Always prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so if there's some downtime, if you're thinking about this, we should at least put some sort of a plan together or a break glass plan that you can just quickly refer to. And the benefits of having a plan like this is a crisis communications situation is very stressful, just in itself. And so if you don't have a strategy on roles and responsibilities of you or your teammates or what you're doing, it's just going to add a lot more stress to the situation. So I jotted down a couple things here that I think, if you don't mind, if I can run through them here in terms of
Absolutely
how to plan and what you kind of really need to think of. So first, it's really basic things like who has access to your social media and who's in charge of that, and who's going to be, responsible for posting that.
Okay.
An email list. You have a client email list. Is it up to date? Do you want to create a separate email list? Again, who's responsible for executing, whether that's through MailChimp or another platform? Who's in charge of that? And make sure you have a backup for some of these things. What can go wrong will go wrong. So when a crisis unfolds, the person responsible, that the only person in the company that knows MailChimp is on vacation out of the country, right? And so that will happen. And so making sure you have a backup plan for those, obviously phone numbers, and then larger firms, if there is an external crisis where you're going to need some sort of spokesperson or some person speaking to someone else who is good at communicating. Is it someone that is good, is personable, is very clear, has good public communication skills. So identifying those roles will make navigating the crisis so much more simple. Again, you can't plan for what's going to happen because it's so unique, but you can at least get some of those aspects down where you can say, okay, cool, after we figure it out, let's go execute. And there's no extra stress involved figuring out who's doing what.
Right. Okay. So have a plan in place. So something happens. What are the first steps that you should take?
Okay. So I just drafted,
Yeah.
as I shared with you, kind of I think I distilled it down for this episode, and I distilled it down to 8 really high level steps,
Okay.
very high level steps that I think uh, you can kind of run through with you and your team or by yourself. And so, if you don't mind, I'll quickly run through those right now.
Yeah.
The first one of the most important ones, is to breathe. Breathe. Um, when a crisis happens, it's very easy for someone to go to the worst possible situation, worst case scenario. Hey, my Aunt Barbara is going to see this. She's going to think I'm a terrible person. I'm going to lose all my clients. Like, what am I going to do? Just breathe. No one's perfect. Something will happen. You need to remain calm and try and be as objective as possible.
Okay.
Move forward to breathe. The second one is figure out the facts. You need a complete understanding of what happened. We briefly talked about a potential scenario, which is a hack, right? Which I'll refer to throughout this. If your information is hacked and there's sensitive information out there, you need to understand all the facts. How did this happen? Hey, have we stopped this yet? Who's involved? Whose information was leaked? Figure everything out. When did this happen? What the timeline is. You want to have the entire truth of the situation.
Mm-hmm.
You want to have that down. You really want to understand what happened, because I think the biggest thing when people don't execute a good crisis communications plan is they're not being completely transparent, whether that's purposely withholding information or they just don't know. I've seen times where teammates maybe are nervous about being culpable or nervous about getting in trouble, and so they withhold information, and
Right.
it leads to a worse outcome for the company at whole. And so, especially if you have teammates, just be honest, be transparent. We're all human. We all make mistakes. Like, we got to work as a team to figure this out. And
Right.
then later, if you want to figure out personnel issues or whatever, do that later. And so that's the second one. And then the third one is understand the stakes. I think, again, this is where having a PR person or a third party come in and being able to be objective is
Right.
understanding the stakes. Is the New York Times calling you, or is it just someone on Facebook that left a comment, on your post, right?
Okay.
Those are two very different crises.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? And so understanding the gravity and understanding the audience. So in the case of our hack is, okay, how much information went out? Was it 3 clients? Is their information was exposed? And maybe it was just how much, I don't know, how much revenue they made last year or something, or how much what
Right.
their income is, or was everything released and all the social security numbers got out there and everything. And so understanding the gravity and who's kind of in on the crisis or who's asking the questions.
How quickly should you be responding? And actually, before you answer that, for our audience, I do have a QR code up in the corner here that will take you to the 8 steps that John's going over with us.
Yeah.
Yes. So, how quickly should you be responding when something happens? Or, I mean, I assume it's case by case scenario, but maybe not. You're the
It
PR
is case
expert.
it is case by case. However, I think the best way to distill it is you need the quality of the response and the tactic you use is more important than how quickly you respond to it.
Okay.
Right. And so again, that's gonna depend on, again, if it's a post or someone blowing up your social media, you can probably address that pretty quickly right there. But
Right.
still, you need to take some time to think about the messaging. Again, if you're working with the media, we'll get into this further with you, but they'll typically give you a little more time. But again, it's you really want to think through the tactics and the messaging. That's more important than a swift response, because
Okay.
you really get one shot at this, at kind of quelling this at least.
Mm-hmm.
If you move too quick because you're nervous and you say the wrong thing or you do the wrong thing or more information comes out because you don't know the whole story, that can just make things much worse and really reduce the trust your clients have, with you, in you. So.
Yeah. Okay.
And then the next one is consider possible tactics. So briefly mention again, if it's just a social media post, you're just going to, post it, maybe respond to that post in there. If it's a New York Times reporter, obviously you need to consider speaking with him or her, maybe putting out a press release. maybe not speaking with anyone, maybe, more than likely, I wouldn't say more than likely, but a good percentage of tactics used for crises is doing nothing. And that's really hard for people just because it's such an emotional time. You're in contact and all this stuff. They want to do something like, no, I'm a good person. I want to know, I want to do, I need to solve this. And really oftentimes the best thing is like, let's just breathe for 24 hours and see where this goes. And then people realize like, oh, okay, I didn't need to say anything. And so that's a potential tactic too. And then of course, draft your message. We can talk about that later. And then here, I think the number 6 is the best and worst case outcomes. Each tactic is tied to an outcome. And so again, in the case of sending out a press release, maybe not many people knew about it, and you send out a press release to your list of clients, and everyone's like, "Oh, what happened?" And you make the problem worse. And so, mapping the tactic you use to a potential best case outcome and worst case outcome, that's going to really clarify what is the best way forward. Just dropping it down and saying, all right, can I live with this worst case outcome? Or, do I want this best case? Like, what is the ROI on each tactic? And then you'll you'll figure that out then.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. I like that strategy. Best and worst case scenarios or outcomes.
You don't think about it, right? I mean, it's not binary. If I send a tweet, there's a lot of things that can happen with that. That can get picked up by whatever, right? So it's not binary, and so you have to really consider you have really to consider the range of outcomes and what are you most comfortable with happening. So, and then the last 2 are execute with confidence. I think people tend to second guess. I second guess things sometimes. I still do all the time. But you have to understand if you take these steps, you really think it out. You talk to people. You bounce ideas off each other. It's been 4 hours. You've been just drilling this home. You have to talk to yourself and say, all right, we're going with this. We've really thought this through. We just got to make sure we knock this out of the park. So execute with confidence. And then the last one is move on. After that, you just got to move on. People make mistakes. The more you harp on it, you should still probably monitor it for a week after. But after that, you just got to keep moving forward. It's only going to weigh you down if you continue to harp on this. Of course, you need to learn from it. Tell your clients and tell your team that you've learned from this, and we're going to be accountable and address whatever happened. But you have
to. Now, we did not talk about this beforehand, so I apologize that we didn't prep. But the Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni, do you have any thoughts on how they've handled it from a PR point of view? And they should have done this differently.
Well, I am fascinated with this. I actually have followed this. I think it's really interesting. I don't have a ton to say on that, quite frankly, because it's not my wheelhouse, and that is a whole different thing. I will say, there's team. I'm not anyone's team. As an objective, calling balls and strikes here. I think on Blake Lively's part, if you're going to, and this is similar to the tactics you use in your crisis response, if you're going to put something out there, you better know everything that's out there, right? So that maybe she didn't know some of the materials that Justin had. It's you. If you're going to go out there, especially with such force, or again, if you're going to put out a press release based on you better know all the facts. If you're going to put out a press release and say, XYZ happened, this happened, we're doing this. And then a week later, something else comes out. It's like, no, you also did this. You're also at fault for not securing, or there was some sort of, negligence. God forbid there's some sort of criminal negligence, but, you're legally responsible. That's a problem. So, that's my take on that is if you're going to go out with something, especially a lawsuit, you better know what the opponent has. You better have some opposition research on that.
It's a crazy situation, and that's the big PR thing I know that's going on right now.
That's all I'll disclose my thoughts on that. I mean, we could have a whole other podcast on
so true.
That, but I won't do that
now. Okay, so we've talked about the importance of being prepared. The 8 steps of what to do when something happens. What about crafting the right message? How can a business ensure their messaging is clear, empathetic, and effective, essentially?
So I want to make sure we separate tactic from message. Those are 2 separate things.
Okay.
They work very much together. But I think in terms of messaging, I guess I say that because tactically there there may be times where you don't want to necessarily admit some sort of guilt or fault, or you want to word that in a certain way, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's just a strategy, and that's not trying to cover anything up. There's just in some cases it's best to kind of talk around something or not necessarily admit a certain type of guilt
Yeah.
for whatever reason. But in terms of messaging, I have always leaned towards accountability. I've
Mm-hmm.
always leaned towards being, um, understanding that, hey, I made a mistake, or hey, we made a mistake. And
Yeah.
maybe it wasn't your fault as an advisor or a business owner, but
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, it is your fault. The buck
Mm-hmm.
stops here. I'm the CEO. I have your information. I'm responsible for it. Because I think in my experiences, and this is just how I feel, no, you're not going to please everyone. You're not going to appease everyone, especially in a crisis situation.
Right.
But being accountable, being empathetic, and then building, ensuring to your clients that you've learned from this mistake and you're going to be better going forward, and this will never happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, hopefully it won't, and you mean that.
Right.
But to me, I've on the other end, being a consumer, I felt like I've trusted a brand more, knowing that, hey, like, we made a mistake, we messed up, we're going to learn from this,
Mm.
and we're going to keep moving forward. Actually, I think that creates more trust
Yeah.
personally,
Right.
and so that's kind of how I was lean in the messaging.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would also say I always like to role reverse and flip around.
Mm-hmm.
How would you, if your information was out there and someone was responsible for it, what would you want to hear from your advisor or that agency or that company? What would you want to hear from them? Are
Right.
you putting those notes? And so I think those are the best ways to do it. Certainly, each situation's case by case.
Right.
That's
Right.
probably the best way that I would advise.
What about if there is like some public backlash, or, that New York Times, they did interview you and it came out and it was really bad. What should you do at that point?
Well, so working, and again, I'm not gonna, I don't want to. I guess this is somewhat biased, but it is real in the sense that PR people are really helpful,
Hmm.
especially in crisis communications. I found, and I tell clients all the time that, hey, I have crisis communications experience,
Yeah.
but I don't necessarily work for a crisis communications firm. I mean, those people are really good at what they do. That's all they do. They're always in the trenches, but
Hmm.
they typically tend to cost more because it's the drop of a hat, you need them,
Right.
and they know that, and so they're like, hey, we're going to charge you a little more for our
It's like the
experience.
emergency vet.
Yeah, exactly. And it's not to say it's not worth it. It's just a lot of
Right.
money, And so, but when you're working with a reporter, having a PR person is really important
Mm.
because it's understanding the journalistic integrity and guidelines that they're supposed to follow, and there is some strategy to it. And I'm sure I think we're going to get to an example later, but
Hmm.
when you're working with a reporter, typically this is how it unfolds, right? So, say for instance, I don't know, you're one of the largest financial advisor firms out there, and again, you had a
Yeah.
data hack, and the New York Times is calling you like, "Hey, what's happened? What's happening? What's happening?" Um, Typically, with reporters that are from a credible institution or a credible publication, they have
Mm.
to follow journalistic standards of they have to reach out to you. So they may have written that story. There's different phases of this. They could just be
Right.
start reaching out to you up front, be like, hey,
Mhm.
I'm curious to see what happened, what's going on. Or they may have written the story, maybe it's 70, 80% done, and they generally worked with their writer and they pretty much know how they're approaching the story and how they're going to write it. Now they just need to get your comment because they're writing about you or writing about the situation. So those are
Mm.
two separate scenarios, and those are two different tactics. What I will say
Right.
about working with reporters is, you know, when they first reach out to you,
Mm.
don't feel you have to say I want to speak off the record.
Mm.
That's the first thing. And it's at some point they're going to run something, and you
Mm.
maybe need to put something on record. But at first, when you just want to talk to them, it's like, hey, just make sure, hey, are we off the record? I want to make sure we're off the
Gotcha.
record first. I want to give you all the details on my side. I want to make sure we can speak freely here.
Right.
So let's jump off the record. And the
Yeah.
reporter typically will say, sure, let's talk about it. And so then you walk through, and sometimes you can kill the story
Mm.
um, doing that, just speaking the facts, driving certain messaging, saying things. Because a lot of reporters, what they'll do, and the good ones are they'll be friendly. They'll
Mm.
pretend
Mm.
that they're your best friend, and
Of
then they
course.
will ask simple or open ended questions and get you to speak.
Mm.
this is where a lot of people, I hate to say it, but like that's where they hang themselves in the sense of,
Right.
they think they're friendly, they're talking about it, and also as a person, you want to be like, I'm so sorry, like it's not my fault. Here's why, blah 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 blah. But at the end of the day, they're after the story,
Mm.
and so just keep that in mind. And then one other thing I'll talk about working with the media is you don't even have to speak to them if you don't want to, and there is a way for you to email them, right?
Okay.
So instead of being forced to get on the phone, if someone's calling you voicemail, you can either text them back typically and be like, "Hey, I got your message. What's your deadline? When do you need something from me?"
Mm-hmm.
Again, they're typically working off a deadline. Some publications like Business Insider used to be notorious for this. I think they're changing a little bit, but they would basically write a story up and then give you 1 hour to respond, which is
Mm.
clearly shady. It's
Mhm.
not great, and it just is what it is. But
Yeah.
other reporters say, hey, like we have a couple hours. Can you get some to me by like 8 p.m. tonight? And so in that event, I would recommend just drafting up an email with a
Mhm.
statement. It's much easier to put your thoughts down, make them coherent. You can edit it. You can really think through again, kind of the different outcomes when you say things, versus being rushed to get on the
Yeah.
phone.
Put on the spot.
I would, unless you're like you do this all the time and you
Hmm.
are a gifted orator or public speaker, I would recommend just doing it over email with a reporter.
Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Um, okay, so let's talk about a real life example. Do you have one of a business who handled things well or maybe poorly? And what kind of lessons could we take away from that?
Sure. So I have two examples. One is kind of just an example that I hope your audience can learn from is
Yeah.
we were sending out a pitch on an education program
Mm.
to a whole bunch of different reporters. It was like
Mm.
10 reporters. So not many, but on the list, we didn't necessarily vet the list. On the list was a blogger that
Mm.
was basically that was in opposition of our point of view.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, and the thing about bloggers, and again, I wanted to make sure it was a blogger, is they're not necessarily tied to the journalistic standards of normal
Mm-hmm.
publication, and
Mm-hmm.
so try to avoid that situation. The
Yeah.
client's happy about this,
Mm.
and so I talked to her. She was friendly, but she had a point of view, and she disagreed with what we were trying to do, and so I talked to her. I gave her all the information. I gave her this video of this person speaking, like, hey, this is what we
Mhm.
pulled from. This is what this person said. And at the end of the day, she didn't write it as a story, but she wrote like a column or an
Mm.
editorial column that
Okay.
basically wasn't like a report. And
Mm.
that was their get around.
Yeah. Okay.
And that was frustrating. And so they don't have the journalistic. You can't go off the record with the blogger. They're just going to write.
Right. Right.
You know what I mean? But typically, I found with large like Substack reporters or independent journalists,
Hmm.
typically the bigger they are, the more professional they are. They're going to
Hmm.
have some courtesy, assuming you're not mean to them or you're not being rude.
Right.
So that's one example. I want to make sure I flag for our audience. Just be careful who you're sending things to and who you're speaking with.
Right. Yeah.
The one example that it worked really well was I was working with a VC firm,
Mhm.
and they were at an event.
Mhm.
The person originally speaking on the panel wasn't able to go, so they sent another staffer. And so that staffer, little did they know, there was this blogger
Mhm.
that was going there to basically tape what our client was going to say.
Mm.
So this person actually followed around our client and was taping his private conversations
Mm.
with other
Oh.
people. Yeah, which is shady to say the least.
Yeah.
And so he made some comments that weren't great, that weren't necessarily false, but weren't great, but they weren't bad. It just,
Yeah.
if you didn't understand the context, yeah, you were like, oh, this is really shady. And so what happened was, in this scenario, the blogger sent it to a corresponding publication that does have a larger audience, but and so they picked up the blog and wrote it in their piece.
Mm.
And so I would say it was like a tier 3, maybe even a tier 2 publication. So it wasn't
Mhm.
like hadn't gotten to like the Times or Journal or whatever, and it had the potential to.
Yeah.
And so what we did was again, we breathed. And of course, we're not the client. So that's why, again, you having a third party person that can look at this objectively.
Yep.
It's not emotional for us, for us that we could kind of, game plan it out. But we didn't do anything. What we did was we drafted statements. So again, I think another tactic to do is you can always prepare. So you can draft statements, you can draft messaging, basically do all the behind the scenes work in the meantime.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately what we decided to do was our thinking was, hey, this tier 2 publication, generally speaking, isn't necessarily that well respected because of how the type of journalism they do. I don't think we should do anything right now because this might get bigger. If it does get picked up, by a New York Times or like
we've got statements ready.
Yes, you have everything ready. That's when you address it. But if you address something, if you address a crisis or an allegation,
right, you're making it an issue.
You're substantiating. And so we decided not to do anything, and thankfully it didn't go anywhere. It didn't get picked up, and so we were able to talk them off the ledge. And there's been other situations too. In one situation, we killed a follow-up story with the Washington Post, basically we created messaging. So this is kind of the game within the game. But if you know what the reporter wants to get out of you, if you know a reporter is going to ask you questions and understands where they're going, the great thing about this one was we had an initial Washington Post story to reference, and so we knew generally where they were going to go and what they were going to write about. And so every time the reporter asked questions, we answered the question, but we trained so much with the client that he was able to answer it with a lot of positive spin, and was able to kind of answer the question, but driving our messaging.
Yeah.
And the reporter's like, all right, well, listen, I appreciate your time. And ultimately they didn't have anything to go on because we wouldn't necessarily give them what they wanted. And so those are some real life examples that could be helpful, and hopefully everyone can learn from them. But again, it's having a PR professional does help.
Yeah. I just, in my head, I keep seeing like from a TV show, stick to the messaging.
It's yes. You'd be surprised at some people. I mean, like generally marketing people are pretty savvy, right? So I'm sure you're like, you get it, but when you're working with like technical people or engineers or all these people that are very obviously brilliant, but they're just not, they don't have that skill or that thought process to talk. Just, it's easy for them to talk about things.
Right.
You can find with some of the clients that are, again, engineers or technical, they just have word vomit, and it just doesn't help sometimes.
Right. I can, sometimes my husband goes on technical tangents that I don't understand.
Well, that's it too, because they're also talking about things. You have to understand the audience you're speaking to. You have to, if you're saying these things that are going over this reporter's head, or your audience for that matter, they're like, I don't understand. You got hacked, and you're talking about, CISIS and all these different platforms. It's like, what are you doing about my problem? You know what I mean? To your point, yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah. Talk about what you know.
Exactly.
Unfortunately, you know more than me. No. No, this was really great. Just a call out to the audience if anyone has any last minute questions for John and what to do in a crisis situation. You can put them in the chat. We'll see them on our ends. And I also pop them up on the screen. If you watch this after we're live and you have a question, I'll be sure to tag John and he can answer anything remaining. Where can people find you? And what if they want PR help? What should they do?
Okay. So you can find me on my LinkedIn. I'm sure it's tagged with this. My website is arichopinion.com. And if people want PR help, I think there's a range of options out there. PR is now expanded to not just media, but a lot of different things. So I would just really focus on what outcome do you want, and it's not just getting in the press. Because people, if you're like, I want to get a story, and you're gonna have a million people trying to work with you. If you want to get into the media, there's got to be a reason. Do you want content? Do you want digital media? Do you want podcasts? So I would really focus on one. If you're just starting into PR, focus on one specific element. So be like, hey, let's just start doing some podcast pitching. Let's start there, master that. Okay, let's build our social media pages up. Let's do that. And so just tack on. You can't do PR all at once because it's going to be too expensive and it's going to take too long for someone just starting out. So that'd
I
be
would say marketing's the same way.
yeah. So you get good at one thing, focus on it, get really good, then build on that. And as you're doing that, from a PR perspective, you're going to build your community, you're going to build your brand. And it's not something you can do overnight. You can't expect to just get in a publication 1 week after hiring a PR professional. That's just not the case. So if you are patient enough and you plan enough, it will reap benefits, but it does take time.
How long does it take?
It varies. It varies on what you're doing. I would say at least 3 to 4 months at the bare minimum to give someone, if you really want to stand up a campaign, because we have to go through, who all your principles, what goals you're trying to achieve, the messaging, what tactics, and then, obviously things are a lot more digital now, which is why I'm really focusing on content and video. But you got to build up a community for you to have any credibility. I think a lot of people want to, again, get in Forbes, get in some of these industrial publications, but they don't even have any digital presence. And so as a PR professional, I can't pitch this reporter and be like, hey, here's Joe Schmo, but that person doesn't exist online, right? There's no trail of his thoughts or his notoriety. So that's kind of where it needs to start.
Interesting. That was a good little nugget there at the end. John, thank you so much for sharing with us today. And again, John's website is arichopinion.com. So yes, thank you. This was very informative and I appreciate it.
Well, I had a lot of fun. Thank you for inviting me, and we'll be in touch. We'll see each other again.
Absolutely. And for the audience, make sure that you join us. It's not popping up. It should have popped up when I clicked this. There we go. Join us next Monday. We are talking with Melissa how to network like a human, not a salesy weirdo. So it should be very interesting. Make sure to join us. As always, it's at noon Central on Monday. Until then, have a great week.